As Annie mentioned, I grew up on the other end of San Francisco Bay in Fremont. But I first got to know your pastor, Barbara, when we were both serving in the Pennsylvania Southeast Conference. Then we reconnected here in California when we were in an interim ministers group together. I was very happy when Barbara asked me to supply, and also happy that this turned out to be my one Sunday a month off from my other position, which is as bridge pastor of the First Congregational Church in Stockton. And so I'm very happy to be here. And it was definitely a surprise to run into an old friend. And it's very fitting that where my sermon is going today, because we were reminiscing about my father, and I'm beginning with a story about him. My dad, Ray Foote, collected 78 RPM phonograph records. And I see Lynn shaking her head in remembrance. I think you're probably all within the age to remember 78s, at least as something maybe your parents had, if not you.
We remember grandpa.
Well, I'm going to mention that too in a moment. But if though you are forgetting about this, 78s were sort of the analog version of Spotify. But Dad didn't just collect records. He had them put into albums orderly by performer and record label. I don't know, most people are familiar with the 10-inch 78s, but there were two sizes. There were 10-inch and there were 12-inch. Actually, there were a few 7-inch too, but that was another thing. But their special albums were made that had slots for 8 to 12 sleeves worth of records. And so one of the jobs that I had was to keep track of how many records my dad had in his collection. And I did this count about every 2 years up through high school. And at that time, he was at 10,000. And so we just sort of lost count after that. But he continued to add to his collection until a couple of years before his death, which was about 18 years after that. But my dad could find in a matter of minutes any record in that collection. In fact, something I thought about that I hadn't put into the sermon was when I started in seminary in Chicago, I went to a conference in New York City and actually stayed in the Statler Hilton Hotel, whose phone number is Pennsylvania 65000. And I mentioned that, and in about 15 seconds of the phone call to my parents, I heard in the background my dad playing the Pennsylvania 65000 on the record player. But the way he kept track of it is that he used Dymo label tape, and he put on the back the name of the artist or group, what record label it was, and then a code number. So Decca Records, I recall, were in blue Dymo tape, Columbia's were in green, and Victor's were in red. He had, for example, I believe 7 albums of Bing Crosby, and that's not counting the ones that were Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters. And then those were then filed on 3x5 cards by, there'd be one card for artist, which might be the same on both sides, so it could be on one card, and then one for each side's song. So there could be 3 or 4 cards for every record. And then the other job I had was to keep those in filing cabinets, of which I think he had about 20 or 30 filing cabinets by the time he was done with that. But if you wanted to hear, for example, that famous Bing Crosby Andrews sister, Mele Kalikimaka, all you had to do is look up either the artist or that title, and you'd see that it was there in Decca 10C, pull it out, and put it on the record player. Well, a couple of years before his death, my father sold his collection to another collector, but I was able to keep one set of his records, his Enrico Caruso collection that are in file Victor 12C. I left the file on the edge to remind myself. One of my dad's favorite lines was, he didn't know how to play any instrument except the phonograph. And that was the other thing he collected, was phonographs. Wind-up phonographs, 2 of which I inherited. One is a late console Edison machine that uses special thick records. That one still plays. I have it in my office. The other is a light oak tabletop Victrola, which is actually darker than it was when my dad stained it because it was in the Centerville Library when it burned down. Or actually burned out. The building still exists, but it was in the window, so luckily it was only smoke damaged. Unfortunately, that one no longer plays because the mainspring has sprung. I tried to get it fixed. I had a minister friend in Pennsylvania who was also a jeweler, and he tried his diamond tips that would go through anything, and it wouldn't make a dent in the steel that Victor used in that spring. Oh well. But on the side of that photograph is, of course, a picture. And anyone know what that picture is? A dog and the phonograph. His master's voice is the title of it. The dog's name is Nipper, if you didn't know that. And the original painting made in 1899 by a man named Francis Barrade must have understood the relationship between a pet and its owner. It doesn't take long for a dog or a cat to identify its master's voice. If our son Aaron calls us and we put it on speakerphone, our cat Tigger pricks up his ears, yet he's confused because he can't see or smell him, which are the ultimate proofs for a cat. Well, Jesus uses a similar image when he explains to his disciples his love for them and his relationship with them. But instead of a dog or a cat and its master, he talks about shepherds and sheep. For people in Palestine in the first century, tending sheep is a familiar activity. Most of us are probably less familiar with shepherding, although on my commute from my home in Rancho Cordova, east of Sacramento, down to Stockton, I pass by a large flock of sheep that's usually out pleasantly grazing in the grass. But for Jesus' first century audience, the mere mention of the relationship between a shepherd and sheep invokes many images. The shepherd leads the sheep to good pastures, looks for stray lambs, protects the sheep from predators, acts as a midwife when ewes give birth. The shepherd knows each of his or her sheep and values the life of each one. And each lamb knows its master's voice because it's the voice of one who cares for it. Shepherds are deeply devoted to the flock because it's not only their way of life, it's also their livelihood. If anything should happen to a lamb, the shepherd has a significant loss for the year that can't easily be replaced. So the shepherd and the sheep have a close relationship. The sheep need the shepherd need the sheep. In referring to himself as a shepherd, Jesus gives us a way of understanding his ministry. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he's brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Much as Nipper hears his master's voice, part of our task as Jesus' followers is to recognize our shepherd's voice and follow. Unfortunately, with so much noise in the world clamoring for our attention, it can be hard to separate Jesus' voice from all those other sounds. Many people have noted that during the height of the COVID pandemic, it was so much quieter. Fewer cars were on the road, and there were so many fewer airplanes roaring overhead. There's so much clamor in our complex and difficult 21st century world. There's so many distractions. Buy this, go here, do this, forget that, answer this test, post that to Facebook, get ready for this Zoom meeting. Every voice competes for our attention. and it's harder and harder to ignore social streams. Yet we can only pay so much attention before we overload and just have to shut out, quiet. Now, I have to admit, I've always been a little uncomfortable with Jesus calling us sheep. Sheep have become a symbol in our culture of a mindless compliance with the status quo. There's even been coined a word to describe people who follow blindly like sheep. Sheeple. Even if you're comfortable with going along with everyone else, there's also the truth stated by the farmer in the classic Monty Python television sketch, sheep are very dim. Not so very long ago, our churches put a lot of stock into knowing everything you could about the tenets of the faith. Some of the churches I served in Pennsylvania until the 1980s had a 2-year confirmation program that required confirmands to memorize every word of the entire Heidelberg Catechism, which was written by the German Reformed Church well over 200 years ago. They continued doing this for so long because, as more than one church member told me, that's what we had to do. They followed along as content sheep. Yet knowing what our ancestors in faith believed is at best secondary to living the faith. Now, I could give long sermons on the points of the ancient creeds and the debates between Martin Luther and John Calvin, but my most important task is the same one that each of us is called to encourage and support others as each of us makes our own personal journey in faith, to follow where you hear your shepherd's voice leading you. Many of those who first heard Jesus' claims to be one with God demanded evidence. They wanted to see signs that would demonstrate the truth of what he said. They wanted proof. What Jesus gave them instead was a statement. I am the good shepherd. The only proof Jesus gives that he truly is the good shepherd is in his loving self-sacrifice for the people of God. The proof is in the power of the cross and the power of Christ's resurrection. Good Friday and Easter morning are the proof that Jesus of Nazareth is who he says he is. On this Good Shepherd Sunday, we celebrate God's great love as it is revealed in Jesus Christ's total gift of himself on our behalf. He is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep and takes it up again. In those two acts, crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus gives us the abundance of eternal life. As Christians, we receive this gift when we hear Jesus' voice calling each of us by name. When we trust the Good Shepherd with our whole life, we will never be separated from God's love. During the time when we were social distancing, we found what we can do on our own. But it also showed us how much we miss doing things together. In a similar manner, we can be good without God, but it's harder when we go it alone. With God, our shepherd's voice supports us when our own voices fail. Our shepherd's hands support us when our own hands fail. Our shepherd's feet carry us when our own feet fail. We gather to hear the voice of Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. I will lead you where you need to go. I am with you when you need to stay. Wherever I am, you are in green pastures. Listen, the shepherd calls. May we respond to our shepherd's voice as the sheep of his pasture. Amen.